Good morning. Today we have myself, Nicole Teska, as well as Bob Teska, and we are going to discuss with you a couple items. First being the Paycheck Protection Flexibility Act, which was signed by the President on Friday afternoon, so that is now official law. And we will also discuss with you the status of some frequently asked questions we are expecting from the Treasury on the Paycheck Protection Program.
Yeah, this was good to get passed. The House passed it pretty quick. The Senate signed it without any changes, and then the President signed it pretty quick thereafter. It's only 7 pages long as compared to the over 300 pages of the CARES Act, but it goes a long way to modifying the PPP program to kind of get it more, I think, back in line with the intent of the CARES Act, to make this a pure stimulus package and to have these loan proceeds be forgiven. When we were applying for loans and helping clients apply for loans under the PPP program, it was a sprint because we were afraid of the funding was going to run out. When looking at the loan forgiveness piece, I think we need to look at this as a marathon because there's going to be continuous updates on this, and we're going to have a much longer period of time to apply for forgiveness in. So I don't think we should rush for the forgiveness piece, and I think the Flexibility Act here gives us some reasons to believe that. And lastly, the SBA had issued a loan forgiveness application. It's going to have to be amended based on the Paycheck Protection Flexibility Act here. So let's get into some of the details of this.
So one of the major items that came out of the Flexibility Act was the changes on how the proceeds are to be spent. Originally, they said 75% on payroll, 25% on non-payroll, and now they've moved that to 60% payroll and 40% non-payroll. So that's obviously a big change and a big win for those that took out the PPP loan.
Yeah, definitely. Again, I think this goes a long way to making it easier to have the whole loan forgiven. One of the nuances here is that the 60% that you have to spend on payroll is now what they're calling a cliff. Meaning that you have to spend 60% of the proceeds on payroll costs or none of the loan is going to be forgiven. So that's going to be important to look at. Before, under the 75% rule, it was proportional. If you didn't quite spend 75% of your proceeds on payroll, there would be a calculation and there would be a proportionate amount of what you spent on payroll and what you spent on overhead costs that would be forgiven. Now, having dropped to 60%, you've got to spend 60% on payroll for any of it to be forgiven. But I think the way the rest of this is laid out, it should be relatively easy to make that happen.
That was the intent of this passage, so yes. The next item, maturity date for the PPP loan, is extended from 2 years to 5. However, this only applies to anyone that hasn't taken out a loan yet and is in the process of it or still needs to take out a PPP loan. For those that already had one and already have their loan documents and already are 2 years, you're going to have to work with your lender to see if you can renegotiate that to a 5-year period instead of the 2.
Right, and again, I think this goes back to it's a great feature to have. I think if you're in a boat where you've already got the loan proceeds and you do end up with some amount that's not forgiven, my personal opinion would be that most banks are going to, they'd be willing to work with you on that. However, I think it's almost a moot point because of the way this has been restructured, and that you should be able to get the loan proceeds forgiven. And I can't see too many places where you're going to end up with a significant amount of loan proceeds that don't get forgiven here.
Correct. So if you, again, already have your loan, look at where your payroll costs are. And if you think now that you're reached the minimum of 60 and you have your other non-payroll costs that we've discussed with transportation and utility and other items, then you shouldn't need to extend your loan. But if you think you still might be short, I would ask the lender if you can do 5-year term if you have any concern about not being able to have it all forgiven.
Right. In fact, the Act specifically says it doesn't prohibit banks from extending an otherwise 2-year loan.
Correct. The other thing this Flexibility Act does is it extends the cover period for loan forgiveness. So originally this period starts when you received your proceeds from the loan. You had 8 weeks to spend that on the qualified expenditures. Now they've extended that period to 24 weeks, not beyond, not any further beyond December 31st, 2020. So either 8 weeks, 24 weeks, or December 31st, 2020. And again, if you already have a loan taken out and you were under the impression you had 8 weeks, you can extend it to 24, or you can still elect to keep the 8 weeks if you've already spent it and that was your plan. And now that they've reduced the threshold to 60 and you meet that, you might think the 8 week period is better for you than 24, but 24 is an option.
Right. Something else that's kind of buried in here is that the loan program, as far as when they're going to stop issuing new loans, is still set for June 30th. So I believe this is coming out on the 8th. So you've got about 22 days to apply for a PPP loan if you haven't. And then the new loans are going to stop at that point as it's currently written. But then you've got 24 weeks to use the loan proceeds. And if you just think about the math, when you applied for the loan, it was supposed to be payroll based on 8 weeks of your average payroll. You now have 24 weeks to spend 8 weeks of your average payroll. I can't really envision too many situations where you're not going to spend at least 60% of those proceeds on your payroll. So again, that goes toward this leaning toward making sure that you can get the loan proceeds forgiven, but also in that 24-week period, I would think most businesses are going to be able to spend their entire loan proceeds on payroll costs, and we're not even going to be having the discussion about what qualifies for overhead expenses. And I think that's going to make the loan forgiveness a lot easier for people, because I still get the question probably at this point every day, have we figured out what's covered in the transportation costs listed under overhead expenses? And the answer to that is still no, but it also might be a moot point because we now have 24 weeks to spend these funds.
Correct.
This was some relief that was given in the first bullet point here. You now have 24 weeks to restore your workforce to the levels of the pre-pandemic levels. So what this says is if you had to reduce your workforce during the pandemic, you had to lay people off from June 15th to it's February 15th. We did it. I had my gaffe. February 15th to April 6th. If during that period you had laid people off, you had until the end of your June 30th period to restore your headcount to that level. And if you did that, those people that you brought back would be counted as if they were there the whole time during your covered period. So your headcount part of the calculation would be good. However, if you didn't have the people, you wouldn't be able to spend the funds on the payroll. So it was almost contradictory. Now they're saying you have till December 31st to restore your headcount, and they've given you 24 weeks to spend the payroll costs, making this much easier to get the loan proceeds forgiven.
So the part that's unclear is, what if you restore your headcount at some point between June 30th and December 31st? Do you have to have that full, the restoration right at December 31st? Or as long as you meet it at some point throughout that period, how does that affect your full-time equivalent calculation? And we are unsure on that. Still waiting on further guidance, as I'm sure most of you are sick of hearing that explanation from us, but we still don't have enough guidance now to say, okay, if you extended your 24-week period, but maybe your peak season is July, August, and therefore you reached your max headcount at that period, but you declined again for the winter, how does that affect this? And so we'll still get hopefully we'll get some clarification and be able to share that information with you. But as of right now, for those of you that are, operate every day, no matter what the season is, if you restore your full-time equivalents by December 31st, you won't be have a penalty for not having that full-time equivalent throughout the whole period.
Yeah, so I think this is the part of the presentation where we say, as we currently understand it.
Correct. We failed to mention that when we first started. So yes, as we currently understand this is how we should probably start labeling these webinars.
Correct.
The next piece of the change was related to, there was a couple exceptions if you didn't fully restore your workforce by that June 30th date, now extended to December 31st. If you were an employer who was unable to rehire the same employees that you had at February 15th, or if you were unable to hire similarly qualified individuals by either one of those categories by December 31st, you do have an exception to your full-time equivalent calculation. Or the other exception is if you are an employer who is able to document your inability to return to the same level of business activity that you had before this pandemic started on February 15th due to various requirements and guidance issued by the CDC or OSHA. If you can prove that, you also have an exception to the restoration qualification. However, still not enough guidance to be able to give you any more detail than that, other than that's how it's currently written. And hopefully when the change of the application comes, they'll also give some additional guidance on that.
Right. So all we can do is cross our fingers and wait. A couple of other changes here that, again, I think are beneficial. So when the CARES Act was originally passed into law, it said that there'd be a 6-month deferral period, no payments, no interest, no fees. And then that would essentially be the time that you had to apply for, to use the funds and then apply for forgiveness. What they've done now is said that there's going to be no payments, no interest, no fees until the forgiveness is remitted to the lender. Little unclear on what that means, but what I believe this is saying is there won't be any interest payments or principal until you apply for forgiveness. The bank looks at it, they submit it to the SBA, and then the SBA gets back to the bank and says yay or nay, or this is how much we're going to forgive. And then at that point, the deferral would stop and either everything's 100% forgiven or there'd be a part that is going to be repaid, and then the repayment would start at that point. And then the other point here that lends itself to the forgiveness aspect, applying for the forgiveness more of a marathon, is that you have 10 months from the end of your covered period, which again, that's either going to be the 8 weeks or the 24-week period. You have 10 months from the end of that covered period to apply for forgiveness. And I think it's going to behoove most borrowers to wait a little bit, especially if you're coming up at the end of your 8-week period, possibly this week, to wait a little bit to make sure that we get all the corrections and updates to this so that you're applying for forgiveness under the most advantageous means possible.
And the part that's interesting is that we don't know if banks are going to make you pick an 8-week period or a 24 period. So if you have this 8-week period done and maybe you didn't meet the metrics you needed to be able to have this full loan forgiven, and now we start looking at the 24 weeks, maybe that's better. But in some cases it might not be better for you, and it might be better just to kind of do the calculation now. So I would definitely advise you to reach out to whoever your trusted advisor accountant is and work through these various scenarios to see which one is going to be the best for your situation, because it might be 8 weeks, it might be 24. But either way, to Bob's point, you don't have to submit that loan forgiveness application right away, especially since they keep coming out with new guidance, every day, every week.
And new applications to apply for forgiveness.
Correct. And, each individual bank might have, even though there's a specific application out there that the Treasury put, each bank might have some additional nuances that they're going to want, and you're going to need time for them to get ready. So while we don't know when you can exactly start the loan forgiveness application process. I'm going to venture to guess it's going to be bank by bank. We at least know you have a max of 10 months after that covered period ends when it has to be in. And, you know, in the original CARES Act, going to your point of when is the forgiveness remitted to the lender, it says in the CARES Act that the SBA must provide the proceeds to the lender no more than 90 days after the lender submits the application. So it could take a while still after you submit your application, the bank approves it, the SBA approves it, the SBA funds the lender for this process to take place.
The wheels of government turn slow sometimes.
Correct.
And then just the last bullet point on this slide, the Flexibility Act allows recipients of PPP loans now to take advantage of another piece of the CARES Act. And what that was is that you were allowed to defer the employer portion of payroll taxes, the Social Security piece, which is 6.2% for 2019. Or I'm sorry, 2020, man.
Let's not go backwards.
No, I don't want to redo 2020.
No, go forward.
So if you deferred those payroll taxes at 6.2% to the end of 2020, you would have to pay 50% back during 2021, and you would have to have the other 50% back by the end of 2022. This could be beneficial to some employers. My personal opinion is because this is a trust fund tax and it can, depending on your payroll, I mean, this could add up to a really big number. And if you're not actively setting money aside for this, you know, this could snowball and turn into something that at the end of 2022, you're, you know, up against a brick wall and you can't repay. So I've cautioned any client that wanted to take advantage of it. It is a nice piece of the CARES Act. You've just got to plan appropriately for it, and you've got to be able to, as you're ramping your business back up, set money aside for this.
Yes, I would agree. You don't want to forget that this is going to be due at the end. You know, 50% will be due at the end of next year as you've been making your current payments. So to your point, setting aside a little bit each time you're making those current payments, if you choose to do this option, would be beneficial.
Right.
The status of frequently asked questions from the Treasury. So that they came out with the loan forgiveness application, gosh, 2-3 weeks ago by now, I think it was. And when we did our last webcast, we said, be on the lookout. We're going to do a webinar and have a calculation. But then we started hearing murmurs that the Treasury and the SBA are working on some additional frequently asked questions for that application. So we didn't want to have to do a webinar or send out a calculation and then have it be wrong and have to reissue again. And I think the Treasury was waiting, knowing that this Flexibility Act was in process, waiting for that to pass and what pieces of it were going to pass before they issued their additional frequently asked questions. So originally they were telling us, you know, 20 to 25 were coming out, and now with the Flexibility Act being passed, now it's more like 25 to 30. Clarifications will be coming out, and we keep hearing every day now, any day now, it's going to be out. So we don't really have an anticipated date. I really hope this week. That would be nice.
Yeah, definitely from a personal standpoint, I can't wait till this comes out. The last thing Mrs. T does before she goes to bed at night is checks for the update from the Treasury. And the first thing she does when she wakes up is looks for this. So the suspense is literally putting a damper on my life. So I cannot wait for this to come out.
Well, if they would stop releasing stuff at 10 o'clock at night, I could just check once.
All right, I think that's all we have for today. I guess stay tuned for our frequently asked questions update when they drop.